Welcome to today's video. James' crush on Sarah. Chapter 1: James' infatuation with Sarah. James had always been a hopeless romantic, daydreaming about the girl of his dreams. He had never been one to shy away from expressing his feelings, and he had always been drawn to the beautiful and intelligent girls in his school. But there was something different about Sarah. From the moment James laid eyes on her, he knew that he was in trouble. She had a natural beauty that he couldn't resist, with her long dark hair and sparkling blue eyes. But it wasn't just her physical appearance that drew James in. Sarah was kind, intelligent, and always had a smile on her face. James found himself constantly seeking out ways to be around her, to bask in her presence and to make her laugh. At first, James tried to play it cool. He would make small talk with Sarah whenever he had the chance, and he would try to impress her with his wit and charm. But as time went on, James found himself getting bolder. He started leaving notes in her locker, telling her how beautiful she looked that day or how much he enjoyed their last conversation. He would walk her home whenever he could, hoping to steal a few more moments with her. Despite his best efforts, James couldn't seem to make any real progress with Sarah. She would always smile politely and thank him for his kind words, but she never seemed to reciprocate his feelings. James was starting to feel frustrated and desperate. He was convinced that Sarah was the one for him, and he couldn't understand why she couldn't see it too. James started to become obsessed with Sarah. He would spend hours daydreaming about their future together, imagining romantic scenarios where he would sweep her off her feet and confess his undying love for her. He would go to great lengths to try to impress her, joining the same clubs and activities that she was in, just so he could be close to her. As James became more and more obsessed with Sarah, he started to neglect other parts of his life. He stopped pursuing his passions and hobbies, and his grades started to slip. He found himself constantly distracted, unable to focus on anything other than Sarah. His friends started to worry about him, but he couldn't bring himself to listen to their concerns. He was convinced that he and Sarah were meant to be together, and he was willing to do whatever it took to win her heart. Despite his efforts, James couldn't seem to get through to Sarah. She remained polite and friendly, but she never showed any real interest in him. James was starting to feel defeated, but he couldn't bring himself to give up. He was convinced that if he just tried hard enough, he would be able to make Sarah see how perfect they were for each other. And so, James continued to pursue Sarah, day after day, week after week. He was so consumed by his infatuation that he couldn't see how unhealthy it was becoming. But little did he know, the hardest part was yet to come. Chapter 2: James asks Sarah out on a date. James had been crushing on Sarah for months, and he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to know if she felt the same way. He had spent the entire day psyching himself up for this moment, and now that he was standing in front of her, he was feeling nervous and jittery. "Hey, Sarah," he said, trying to sound confident. "Hey, James," Sarah replied with a smile. James took a deep breath and asked the question he had been rehearsing in his head all day. "Sarah, I was wondering if you would like to go out on a date with me," he asked, his heart racing. Sarah's smile faded slightly, and James felt his stomach drop. Was she going to say no? He was about to blurt out an apology when Sarah spoke. "I would love to go out with you, James," she said, her smile returning. James felt like he was on top of the world. He couldn't believe it. She had said yes. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. "Of course," Sarah said, her eyes twinkling. "I've been hoping you would ask me out for a while now." James felt like he could float away on a cloud of happiness. He couldn't wait for their date. They agreed to meet up on Saturday evening at a new restaurant in town. James spent the rest of the week planning the perfect evening. He wanted everything to be just right. On the night of their date, James arrived at the restaurant early to make sure everything was set up. He had reserved a private table by the window with a view of the city skyline. When Sarah arrived, James was blown away by how beautiful she looked. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. "Wow, you look amazing," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "Thank you," Sarah said, blushing slightly. They sat down at the table, and James ordered a bottle of wine. They talked and laughed and got to know each other better. James found that he and Sarah had a lot in common. They both loved hiking and traveling, and they both enjoyed reading and watching movies. As the night went on, James found himself feeling more and more comfortable around Sarah. He felt like he could be himself and that she liked him for who he was. At the end of the night, James walked Sarah to her car. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," he said, feeling a little sad that it was over. "Thank you for a great date," Sarah said, smiling at him. As they said goodbye, James felt a surge of confidence. He leaned in and kissed Sarah on the cheek. "I can't wait to see you again," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "Me too," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling. James walked back to his car, feeling like he was walking on air. He couldn't believe that he had just gone on a date with Sarah, and it had been amazing. He couldn't wait to see her again and continue their journey together. Chapter 3: James struggles to move on. James had been devastated since Sarah turned down his date proposal. He had never felt this way about anyone before, and the rejection had hit him hard. He tried to put on a brave face, but his friends could tell he was struggling. The first few days after the rejection were the hardest. James would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he could have done differently. He tried to occupy his mind with work, but every time he had a spare moment, his thoughts would drift back to Sarah. He felt lost and alone. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt, but the fact that he had put so much hope and expectation into the possibility of being with Sarah. He had built up an image in his head of how great they could be together, and now that dream had been shattered. He didn't know how to move on from that. James tried to distract himself by going out with friends and meeting new people, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was just going through the motions. He found himself comparing every new person he met to Sarah, and they always fell short. He couldn't help but think that he had missed his chance with someone truly special. As time went on, James tried to rationalize his feelings. He knew that he couldn't force someone to feel the same way he did, and he tried to accept that maybe he and Sarah just weren't meant to be. But every time he saw her or heard about her, his heart would ache with longing. Eventually, James realized that he needed to take some time for himself. He started focusing on his own hobbies and interests, rediscovering the things that he loved to do before he had met Sarah. He also began to see a therapist, who helped him work through his feelings of rejection and disappointment. Slowly but surely, James began to feel like himself again. He realized that he didn't need someone else to make him happy, and that he could find fulfillment in his own life. He started going on solo trips and exploring new places, and he found that he enjoyed his own company. Of course, there were still times when he missed Sarah and wondered what could have been. But he began to accept that the future was uncertain, and that there was no point in dwelling on what might have been. He started to focus on the present, and on living his life to the fullest. In the end, James learned a valuable lesson about love and loss. He realized that sometimes things don't work out the way we want them to, but that doesn't mean we can't find happiness on our own. He also learned that it's okay to feel vulnerable and to ask for help when we need it. He emerged from his struggles stronger and more resilient, ready to take on whatever life had in store for him next. Chapter 4: James finds closure. After weeks of feeling lost and heartbroken, James finally began to find a sense of closure. It wasn't an overnight process, but rather a gradual acceptance of the situation and a shift in perspective. At first, James had tried to distract himself from his pain. He threw himself into work and spent time with his friends, but his thoughts always seemed to come back to Sarah. He wondered what she was doing, who she was with, and if she was happy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake in letting her go. But as time passed, James began to reflect on the relationship and the reasons why it had ended. He realized that while he had cared deeply for Sarah, they were ultimately incompatible in some fundamental ways. He also recognized that he had been holding on to an idealized version of their relationship that wasn't grounded in reality. One day, James stumbled upon a quote that resonated with him: "Closure is simply the end of an episode. It's not the end of the story." It reminded him that even though his relationship with Sarah had ended, it was only one chapter in his life. There were still many more experiences and opportunities ahead of him. Slowly but surely, James began to let go of his attachment to Sarah. He started to focus on his own personal growth and goals, rather than fixating on what could have been with her. He even started dating again, although he didn't rush into anything serious. As he moved forward, James found that his feelings for Sarah began to shift. He still cared for her and had fond memories of their time together, but he no longer felt the ache in his chest that had been there before. Instead, he felt a sense of gratitude for the relationship and the lessons he had learned from it. One day, while walking through the park, James saw Sarah sitting on a bench with a man he didn't recognize. At first, his heart sank, but then he realized that he didn't feel jealous or resentful. He simply felt happy for her and the life she was living. Feeling lighter than he had in weeks, James walked away from the park with a newfound sense of freedom. He knew that he would always carry a piece of Sarah with him, but he also knew that he was ready to turn the page and start a new chapter in his life. Chapter 5: James finds happiness. James woke up with a smile on his face. He felt a sense of contentment and joy that he had not experienced in a long time. As he got out of bed and stretched, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come since his crush on Sarah. It had been several months since he had last thought about her. He had moved on and was now in a much happier place. The pain and heartache he had felt were now a distant memory, and he was grateful for that. James knew that finding happiness wasn't easy. It had taken him some time to let go of his feelings for Sarah, but he had finally found peace. He had started to focus on his career and personal goals, which had brought a lot of positivity into his life. He got ready for work and headed out the door. As he walked to his office, he felt grateful for the new opportunities that had come his way. He had started to take on new projects and had made a lot of progress in his work. His colleagues had started to notice his efforts and were appreciative of his work. During his lunch break, James decided to call up his old friend Tom, who he hadn't spoken to in a while. Tom had been there for him during his tough times, and James wanted to catch up with him and share his newfound happiness. As they talked, James shared his journey with Tom. He told him about his crush on Sarah, the pain he felt when he asked her out, and how he had struggled to move on. He also shared his recent experiences and how he had found closure and happiness. Tom listened to James intently and was happy for his friend. He congratulated James on his progress and said that he was proud of him for not giving up. As James hung up the phone, he felt a sense of gratitude for having a friend like Tom in his life. He knew that his journey towards happiness had not been easy, but having supportive friends and family had made it possible. As James walked back to his office, he felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment. He was excited about the future and the new possibilities that lay ahead. He knew that there would be challenges along the way, but he was ready to face them head-on. James realized that finding happiness wasn't about finding the perfect partner or achieving success in every area of life. It was about finding contentment and joy in the present moment and being grateful for what one had. As he sat back down at his desk, James smiled to himself. He knew that he had found happiness, and he was determined to hold on to it.